outright scares to jump off the page or screen. All right, you guys are getting me for the next section, which is characters. Characters are interesting. When you think of great horror stuff, you often think of the character. Dracula, Frankenstein, horror is full of great characters. But one of the things that I think we sometimes forget is how great the heroes can be in horror too. So one of the things I'm going to discuss a little about today is how to evoke scares by making really great protagonists, as well as a scary creature that's over here. And you know, with the thing with characters is that they are what most often draws us into a story because they are us. They're the human element of a story. So crafting a really great character that your reader can look at and say, oh, I recognize that, is really important. So how do you do that? Well, there are really two types of characters, first of all. That seems fairly obvious, but it's worth repeating. We have the protagonist, the good guy, the hero, the heroine. We have the antagonist. Now in horror, of course, the antagonist is quite often a monster, a supernatural entity, a mad slasher. How do you define these characters? There are three things that I think can really help to create a character. Keep these in mind. Description. If you're writing a novel, you'll want to have description of the character's physical appearance. Dialogue, which of course becomes especially important if you're writing a screenplay. That's often how you define a character in a screenplay. And background. The background is what we learn about the character that helps us relate to them. I'm going to start with a gentleman named H.P. Lovecraft. I hope you know Lovecraft. He is considered, arguably, to be probably the greatest horror writer of the 20th century. This is from a story that he did called The Picture in the House. And this is one of my favorite short stories of his. It's sort of an atypical story for him because it doesn't have a monster, but it's got a very creepy central character in it. In the doorway stood a person of such singular appearance that I should have exclaimed aloud but for the restraints of good breeding. Old, white-bearded, and ragged, my host possessed a countenance and physique which inspired equal wonder and respect. His height could not have been less than 6 feet, and despite a general air of age and poverty, he was stout and powerful in proportion. His face, almost hidden by a long beard which grew high in the cheeks, seemed abnormally ruddy and less wrinkled than one might expect, while over a high forehead fell a shock of white hair, a little thinned by the years. His blue eyes, though a trifle bloodshot, seemed inexplicably keen and burning, but for his horrible unkemptness, the man would have been as distinguished looking as he was impressive. This unkemptness, however, made him offensive. Despite his face and figure, of what his clothing consisted I could hardly tell, for it seemed to me no more than a mass of tatters surmounting a pair of high, heavy boots, and his lack of cleanliness surpassed description. Okay, you're already set up to be afraid of this guy now. You've been told that this guy is strong, that this guy has bloodshot eyes, which is an interesting little piece of trivia that's in there, and that there's something very wrong about this guy. Now, if we look at what kind of dialogue Lovecraft gives this, I almost didn't include this dialogue because it's virtually unreadable. Lovecraft loved to try and write down New England dialect as he heard it. And this is something that you probably shouldn't use if you are a standard writer who's submitting a story somewhere, because most editors will look at it and say, I don't even know what this is. Lovecraft was a master of it. You read this dialogue, and you know again that there's something very strange about this man. This is setting you up to be really afraid of this guy. You know, he's very isolated, he's a backwoods character, he's probably not very educated, and it's just a really uncomfortable way of setting this guy up through dialogue. But there are other ways to do this too. For that, I want to show you a little tiny piece of something from a story by Joe Lansdale. Joe Lansdale is an author working now. He's a master of describing characters. Look at how much he does in just a few words. Wayne stepped out of his '57 Chevy reproduction, pushed his hat back on his forehead, opened the trunk, and got the sawed-off double barrel and some shells out of there. You already know Wayne is strong. You know Wayne is eccentric because he drives a '57 Chevy reproduction, pushed his hat back on his forehead. That's a nice detail. You have a picture of Wayne being a guy who's sort of casual and yet confident. It also sets you up for action. You know, this happens to be from a zombie story called On the Far Side of the Cadillac Desert with Dead Folks. So going into it, you know you're going to get zombie action. But this comes right up front in the story. This sets you up right away to be anxious and to expect that this character Wayne is going to be engaging in something pretty raunchy very quickly. One of the all-time great films for me is The Exorcist. And one of the things that The Exorcist does is use dialogue unbelievably well. And if you remember what I was talking about, using dialogue for the protagonist to set you up for a scare. This is a movie that does that really well. It also uses the dialogue to create these characters in very few words. And this is one of my favorite passages. This comes just before the climactic exorcism. And the young priest, Father Karras, is a psychiatrist, and he's saying, I think it might be helpful if I gave you some background on the different personalities Regan has manifested. So far, I'd say there seem to be 3. She's convinced, and Father Marin, the older man, just comes in and cuts him off. There's only one. Immediately, you know, that Father Marin is very experienced, that he's authoritative, he's in charge here, and that there's something very scary that they're going to encounter. There is only one. They're going to go up against one thing that's very powerful. You also know that the younger priest here is a little inexperienced. He doesn't know what's going on. He thinks he's businesslike. Again, you're set up to know that something's going to go terribly wrong here. Now, one of the things with the antagonist character, which is often a monster, up until fairly recently, those monsters tended to be sympathetic. If you look at the classic Universal monsters here, nearly all of them have something going on besides just killing people or looking scary. Frankenstein's monster, created from dead parts. This guy's the eternal outsider. The bride, of course, forced into an existence that she didn't choose. The creature from the Black Lagoon, who would be a nice creature if they just left him the heck alone. You know, just leave him in his lagoon, let him be there, he's fine. But no, they have to poke him, try to capture him. The mummy, trying to refine his lost love. The Wolfman, cursed. Possibly the only one here would be Dracula, but even Dracula is just trying to survive. He just needs blood to survive. Up until fairly recently, the sympathetic monster was kind of the standard for a lot of horror. And what's great about the sympathetic monster is that, again, it gives us something that we can relate to. Even though this monster is out there wreaking havoc, we look at it and we say, I recognize part of myself in that monster. And that can be really important for helping you to identify with the scares. It can set you up again. It takes you into the world of the monster, where you can feel fear. Sometimes you feel the fear that the monster is feeling sometimes. In the original movie of Frankenstein, there's the great scene where he picks up a little girl and throws her into the lake. And at that point, what you feel horror for is him. I mean, yes, it's awful that he's killed his child, but you realize that he feels bad about it too, because he thought she was going to float like the flowers did. So the sympathetic monster is one way to go when you're creating an antagonist in a horror film or a horror story. But there is another way to go, and this is the way that became much more popular in the 70s, which is, of course, the slasher. As compared to the sympathetic monsters, the slasher was a new kind of horror character because he had virtually nothing to redeem him. There was almost nothing sympathetic about any of these slasher characters. And this kind of changed horror fiction in the 70s and the 80s. But the other interesting thing about these characters is that even though there's nothing sympathetic about them, they're just pure evil, they have a background that makes them very interesting. Freddy is not just a guy who kills kids in their sleep. We know a lot about Freddy in the first movie. We know that he was a child killer, that he was burned alive by the parents of the kids that he killed, that he worked in a basement, that he was a janitor, that he created this saw blade hand. All of those little details add up to make him very interesting. I mean, if you think back about him, and yes, this was a great performance by an actor too, but those details added up to make him a memorable character. I kind of doubt if we would have such fond memories of Freddy and if we would have gone through, 8 movies without those details that added up to make you remember him. If you look at some of the other mad slashers, I mean, of course, Hannibal Lecter, one of the great characters of all time. And yes, Silence of the Lambs is a horror movie, don't let them tell you otherwise. And great character. I don't know that there's anything sympathetic about him, but he's fascinating. You can't take your eyes off of him. Jason had an interesting background, the fact that he was actually this handicapped kid, his mother was killing for him. Even with Michael Myers, I think they realized that he only worked with no background in one film. From the time you get Halloween 2 on, you start to find out about him. That gave them what they needed to carry that character into many other movies. So if you're writing something like a sort of slasher character that's driven by rage, that's just out there to kill, I think you still need to invest some kind of detail and background into them. And by the way, this goes, I think even if you're doing just a haunt. If you're doing a haunt, I think it really works great if you're centering it around a character that's very memorable. And I've been through haunts where they give you interesting character details until you meet that character at the end. And when you meet that character at the end, it's so much more powerful because you already know these things about this character. It's a great way to set up that final scare.